Anti-Black Racism in Canada, Causes, Impacts, and Remedies. I'm Martin Frith on the board of Humanist Canada, and on behalf of Gus Lynn Peluso, President of the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and our boards and membership, thank you for setting aside some time on a beautiful weekend. It was a beautiful day in Toronto. We're dealing with rain now, but setting time aside to engage in this timely and critical discussion. So the webinar will be 90 minutes in length. As I'd mentioned, 60 minutes of discussion with questions as they arise, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a moment to set some context. It was on May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis, George Perry Floyd Jr., a Black American man, was killed by police during his arrest. His horrific death was captured on video by a bystander. And after his death, protests against police violence towards Black people quickly spread across the United States, Canada, and literally around the world. On June 5th, Humanist Canada and the Centre for Inquiry Canada issued a joint statement condemning the killing of George Floyd. But more importantly, we also acknowledge the disproportionate violence against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and marginalized groups here in Canada. And so today's webinar is part of our collective organizational response to engage in a thoughtful and maybe uncomfortable discussion on systemic racism endemic in our current and historical structures. Our exceptional panelists today will be providing insight into systemic racism in Canada, its origin, statistics, the first things we must do to address this issue. Perhaps most importantly, Scott and Ajamu will answer the question, can Canada survive in a multiracial democracy without addressing its racism problem? And so with us today is Vice President at CFI, Shauna Watson, who will be moderating the questions and answers. Our Director of Programs at Humanist Canada, Anna Popovich. And so they're going to disappear, and we'll introduce Scott Fraser. Scott is the president and publisher of Dundurn Press, one of Canada's largest independent book publishers. He's also an essayist with recent pieces in the Quarantine Review, the Hamilton Review of Books, and the award-winning anthology, Black Writers Matter. Now, before working in publishing, Scott spent 8 years as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, where he earned the Canadian Peacekeeping Service Medal for his role with the United Nations mission in Sudan. And he's a graduate of the University of Toronto. And all the way from Jamaica, Ajamu Nangwaya, Ph.D. He's an organizer, academic worker, and writer. He's a lecturer in Rastafari and Cultural Studies at the University of West Indies, Mona Campus, Jamaica. And prior to that, Ajamu was an educator at Seneca College. He completed his undergraduate and graduate studies at the University of Toronto, from which he received a Ph.D. in adult education and community development. His involvement in community-based initiatives that challenged racist and classist policing in the African community resulted in him being a co-founder of the Black Action Defense Committee. And so I'd like to turn over the mic now to Scott Fraser and Ajamu.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that most of us are calling in from somewhere in North America, and for that reason, I want to just take a moment to make an acknowledgement of the land that I'm assuming most of us are sitting in. You're going to hear us make a reference to Europeans and Africans. personally, I use these terms because I think they're more conducive to the kind of honest dialogue that I think is really the only path forward for a sustainable, multiracial, democratic experiment like Canada. I hope that everyone here who's come to learn about anti-Black racism will also take some time to learn about and reflect on the fact that the land that we're occupying here in North America, or Turtle Island, has been populated for a very long time by a lot of different people. And part of coming to grips with anti-Black racism in Canada is to be honest and truthful about how this land came to be populated by both its earliest and original peoples and those of us who have come more recently. So I hope everyone participating today will spend at least some time connecting these dots. We've all got to become amateur historians if we're going to make it as a multiracial society, and a society that reaches its full potential. So without any further ado, I want to make a couple of quick thank yous. First to Caroline Starr at the Healing Collective, healingcollective.ca. She helped me out. She helped us out with some of the marketing materials and the copy for this event. The Healing Collective is involved in all kinds of wellness and mental health activities in the East End of Toronto. So check them out. And Danielle Lewis of Danielle Lewis Designs, daniellelewisdesigns.com. She graciously donated her time and graphic design skill to help make some of the images that we enjoyed prior to the start of this. And then lastly, just a reminder that Dundurn Press is offering 25% off using the discount code CFICHHC, or Center for Inquiry, if you need to help remembering the acronym, CFICHC25, and you can use that coupon at dundurn.com. Lastly, I want to thank Martin and the board of directors at Humanist Canada, and Shauna and Sandra and the board at CFIC. I'm thrilled to say that thanks to your efforts and the energy and interest of your membership, we're in a position to make a nice donation in support of Black voices in the arts and culture sector. Thank you all for coming here today, and just as a way of warming up and kicking off, I wanted to share just a very brief personal story. I was 5.5 years old the first time I was terrorized because of the color of my skin. In that incident, I just started at a brand new school for grade 1, and a much older boy ran up to me in the playground and just started hurling all kinds of horrible, abusive statements at me that I won't even repeat in this august company. It was terrifying, and from that day on, it's been a point of survival for me to start understanding racism, and in particular white supremacy. And I'm not that old. Believe it or not, I'm still in my 30s for a little while longer anyway. I do. So we're not talking about ancient history here. This happened in the mid 1980s, and it's something that that had a deep impact on my childhood, growing up in Canada and trying to make a life for myself here. So with that context out there, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and co-conspirator, Dr. Ajamu Nangwaya. Ajamu spent his youth in Jamaica before, as Martin pointed out, coming to Canada to complete his studies, and very glad that he's able to join us from Kingston, Jamaica today. Ajamu, how are you, brother?
Thanks for having me here. Thanks for having me here, and I look forward to a stimulating and discussion, especially the Q&A, because it's important to hear from people who are participating in this reasoning, because they're the ones that are going to go out into the community, organize to change oppressive conditions in Canada. Because by the mere fact that people are here, it means that there's a level of interest. What we have to do is to transform that into a political, ideological commitment through action in community organizations to change oppressive conditions. And, you know, just to open this discussion, when I deal with racism or white supremacy, you cannot deal with it without also interrogating capitalism. The class question is always implicated in the question of racial oppression. So we're going to also have that type of discussion that we're looking at multiple forms of oppression, because we can change racial oppression, we will still have class oppression, putting certain groups in certain categories that are oppressive, alienating, undesirable. So we're going after both multiple systems at the same time.
So
we're just having this discussion to really isolate the question of racism and anti-African racism.
So we're going to be making people uncomfortable for a multitude of reasons today, then.
Absolutely, and that's good.
It is.
We learn when we're uncomfortable. If we're all right and nothing is bothering us, even though we have the structural problems, that means we're probably not being forthcoming in what we need to say and the things we need to do.
Well, I think it's important to note that we're addressing both a humanist organization as well as a free-thinking, skeptical one. So with that in mind, I really want to start off by getting a good, solid grounding. Can we? So I think most people have at least a rough idea about what racism is. What does systemic racism mean? Let's just be clear about our terms.
Yeah, when we're talking about systemic racism, we're not talking about individual prejudices. We're talking about structures and processes that are in place, institutions that are in place that produce a certain type of outcome. So a lot of times you hear people talking about, we just need to change what's in our heart. That's irrelevant to the question of systemic racism, because irrespective of how you feel, it will not stop the production of racist outcomes for African people and other racialized people or indigenous people. A point that I think would be a good example is Barack Obama serving as president for 2 terms. He was an agent of white supremacy, irrespective of his personal feelings. He was part of a structure that is designed to produce racist outcome, whether it's higher levels of unemployment, higher rates of imprisonment, until he changes the processes, the structures, the institutions. We will continue to have racist outcomes. So when we talk about systemic racism, we are talking about the structures, processes, and institutions that are in place to produce particular outcomes. So we must change those things. So when people talk about we just need a woman in this as the Prime Minister of Canada, we can point to Margaret Thatcher, and you see, oh, she still produced certain patriarchal outcomes because the systems and the structures, processes remain unchanged. So we need to be very, very clear about that. It's not about my individual feelings. It's about changing structures that produce certain outcomes.
I think that's probably one of the biggest hurdles to having a multiracial conversation, because when you talk about white supremacy and you mean it in a systemic way, people get their backs up and they think that you're calling them a bad person. So just to be clear, when we're talking about systemic racism, we're talking about policies, institutions, and outcomes, essentially. Is that?
But we're also talking about individual behaviors, because individuals must carry out the policies. They're the ones who design them. So there's a role for individual responsibility in this, because individuals do reflect racist behavior. So that must also change. That's a part of the conversation, because when you become an anti-racist, you've made a self-conscious decision to work to change those structures, those processes, and change the institutions. So the individual is implicated, but it is the structures in place that are going to be changing them will be the difference maker in the conversation, in the experience of racist oppression, or any other forms of oppression that we're talking about.
Okay. And so with that, I think I'm comfortable. I'm going to assume the best of our audience and assume that barring, there is actually a Q&A. So let's, someone's got a book recommendation. I'll check on that afterwards. So I like book-related questions because, of course, I work in the book industry.
Right.
I'll come back around to those. I'm going to assume then that everyone is okay with that basic definition. And so let me ask you this: what is the evidence for systemic racism? And if you could be specific about anti-Black racism in Canada.
Right. Okay, when we think about anti-African racism, I don't use anti-Black racism because Black doesn't denote the land that we're from as Africans. Africa is the name of the ancestral territory. Black is used for various reasons, even internally. I think the question of identity implicates the preference that some people have for using Black to call themselves as opposed to using African. To me, it's anti-African racism because you're talking about racism against an African people located in Canada. We can, when we talk about racially biased outcomes, we can look at policing. In any city in Canada that we will see we have a disproportionate, and on the negative side, interaction with the police, whether it's racial profiling or the stop and frisk or carding, as we call it in Canada. We will see that we're always disproportionately represented in the statistics. Police shootings, allegations of police violence, we're always overrepresented in that. So if we look also in terms of in the school system and look at educational outcomes, whether it's representation in courses that will lead to university, whether it's representation in the number of expulsion or disciplinary measures, we are overrepresented in those numbers. And again, if you look at the employment side, jobs in the broader public sector, which include like healthcare, education, is a desirable job because those jobs are usually unionized. Africans in the educational system as teachers, as janitors, we're underrepresented because those are good jobs. So racism is going to manifest itself in ways, our anti-African racism will manifest itself in ways that shows that people who are white or even other racialized people would not want to live lives as Africans in Canada. So we look at prison representation. We're always overrepresented in the prison population for African men and African women. They have a disproportionate presence in Canada's federal and provincial correctional facilities, or they are in captivity. They have higher rates of involvement in those areas. So when you look in terms of, and even you look at something like, HIV/AIDS, Africans again are overrepresented in that. And these are the results of structural violence that exists in the system. And when we talk about structural violence, we're saying that based on the resources that are available in a society or in a global context, so when we talk about structural violence, we're looking at things like unemployment rate, the level of access to the healthcare that you need, access to the food that you need to take care of yourself, the quality of access you have to housing. These things kill more people than the people that die as a result of street crime or criminals taking action against them. So structural violence affects African people in Canada at a higher rate than whites in society. And if we are comparing working class whites to working class Africans, again, you will see us on the negative side of those statistics and experience. So it's very, very real when we talk about anti-African racism in Canadian society. And it's there because when you look and say, okay, what could account for this? You're going to see race and class factors at work. Today, if we look at the COVID-19 mortality.
Ajamu, let me jump in here. There's a question, and it speaks to making sure that we're explaining things adequately, I think. So there was a question from Andre. Andre asks, Ajamu, could you expound on your earlier comment regarding leaders such as Obama and Thatcher being tools of white supremacy? I think Thatcher might be a little bit more intuitive, but maybe you can zero in on how could Barack Obama be an agent of white supremacy?
Well, Barack Obama, as president, was an agent of white supremacy because he presided over a white supremacist society and white supremacist institutions, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in policing, education. For example, when we look at how the United States funds its educational system, it's based on the local tax roll or local tax base. So if you have communities that are very poor, they will fund their schools at a lower per capita rate than schools that are in suburbs with a much larger tax base. So as president, since his federal administration hasn't increased the amount of funding to account for those disparities in working class African communities, he is perpetuating white supremacist patterns in terms of access to education. So he would have to expend the political capital to say, look, we are going for schools that experience per capita funding at this rate or this number of dollars. We're going to give them an extra amount so it can bring their funding up to suburban communities or the average suburban community, or the communities are better off communities that with certain spending, you find the average. He didn't do that. So he is perpetuating white supremacy by being the president of the United States and not carrying out actions to change it. The same thing with Margaret Thatcher. As a woman, she was not committed to feminism and changing the structural oppression of women. So she perpetuated the sexist patterns and the sexist outcomes in British society. So she was an agent of patriarchy, and she was an agent of white supremacy and an agent of class oppression. And we know she was an imperialist pig. So that's also a part of it. So it's not about what we feel, but it's the structures, the processes that we're following, and the institutions that we preside over, and leaving them unchanged. We are an agent. And it shouldn't have been unexpected. In the 2008 campaign of Barack Obama for the presidential nomination of his party, I was saying that this guy is the worst thing for African people because it will give the illusion that racial progress is being made. And people are saying, oh my gosh, you must be an Uncle Tom, you know, you don't want to see an African man do well. And I'm saying that his position prior to running for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party wasn't a strong anti-racist one. When he gets the position and then gets elected, nothing is going to change. A lot of people couldn't see that, but a year in, nobody challenged me on my critique of Obama as an agent of white supremacy or an agent of capitalism or patriarchy, because the evidence was there.
Ajamu, there's one more kind of foundational question, and it speaks to some of the terminology that you've been using. Barbara asks, why are you not including Afro-Caribbeans and other nations? I think I know your answer, but just
yes.
Go over that again.
Because what I mentioned earlier, that Africans from Jamaica, other Caribbean territories, they're Africans. You know, maybe African Jamaican, you know, denoting their nationality, but their racial identification is bounded up in their ancestral land, Africa. So Africans born in Canada and have been here from the 17th century or earlier, they are Africans. African Canadians, Canadian denote their nationality. So we know where they're located, and by using African, we know their racial ancestry. So that is the reason why I'm using that. And it's also a political question that we are identifying with our continent, which we think is important to the global struggle against global white supremacy, global capitalism. And we believe by strengthening that territory, it will provide us with a certain level of protection, those of us in the diaspora. And also, there are a lot of Africans who, as a result of internalized white supremacy, are uncomfortable with self-identify as African. So Black give them a way to say that I'm Black, but when you start to question them, they will grudgingly concede that, well, I am kind of African ancestry, but I don't know anything about that. I'm just Black. So it's also a way to challenge Africans to say that we're an African people and we must challenge the internalized racism or the internalized white supremacy that we're experiencing. So I use African at multiple levels, an internal dialogue within the African community, There's also an we are demonstrating self-determination when we say we're African. You call us Negro, colored, and we're saying it's an act of self-determination to call ourselves African, and we're not Black. Black is a developmental thing. Black should be thrown into the cesspool of history as a racial identifier, as a collective name for African people. It has served its purpose. Even Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael.
Hold on, Ajamu. I'm afraid that we're gonna be going a little too fast right now, and I want to. So I think you've done a good job of explaining why you use African, and I will add to that I think it facilitates honesty, especially in a country like Canada, where we're talking about an ongoing colonial experience for Indigenous people who have been dispossessed of their land. Being honest about where we're from, and in my case, if someone really wants to know, and they're not satisfied when I say that I was born in Ottawa, if they really want to know, and usually that means that they're asking about race, I will say that I'm of mixed African and European ancestry, as best as I can work out, and both branches of my family made it to Canada in different ways, but the commonality is through British imperialism, one through the colonial project and one through the Atlantic slave trade. So for me, the honest answer about where I'm from is I'm of mixed African and European descent, and that's how I came to be here. But in any case, I want to. Tanya has a really good question about outcomes. I'm going to read her question. I'm going to give it just a quick anecdotal answer, and then I'll turn it over to you. She writes, Tanya, I don't know your pronouns, but I'm going to. I just assumed she. In the healthcare system, I heard that Black people are given less pain medication than white people. This is because when Black people say they are in pain, they are dismissed. Isn't that an individual racism problem with the healthcare givers? How can the structure and process be changed so that these healthcare workers are not biased in this way? Before you answer, Ajamu, I'll just say another quick note about racism, the kind of embedded racism in the healthcare system. And I will say that I'm very proud of Canada's universal healthcare system. I think it was a great achievement of the Canadian working class to gain that concession from the powerful. But in my experience, when I was serving in the military, I was diagnosed with a cardiovascular condition, and I was for 8 years treated with drugs that have been demonstrated to be less effective with African people. When I released from the military and I was able to select my own general practitioner, I found someone with experience treating African people, and he immediately recognized that I was on the wrong medication. And this is the sort of thing that causes African people to die young. So with that that's my personal experience with a racist healthcare system that I'm actually quite fond of. So Ajamu, can you respond to Tanya?
Yep. Yeah. In that case, Tanya, if we had a medical system that did not use white middle-class people or white people in general as the subject of their study, where you're going through your medical training, you would be exposed to a representation of the people that live there, their healing traditions, the type of ailments that they may experience that may differ from the mainstream. When you meet someone, it wouldn't be the first time that you're meeting this patient. You would have an understanding of the cultural background or the social experiences of these people, or the beliefs systems that may impact people's medical condition or how they approach the healing process. You're not going into the process relying on stereotypes or ignorance. So when we talk about changing processes, structures, institutions, it involves that. Also, it means that you can also have African people fairly represented as medical practitioners. So if you're working in a team, people can provide an input as to what may be going on, or you may know the right set of questions to ask this individual who's sitting before you. And that doesn't mean that you're going to lead to other stereotypes that this group is this way. You will be posing questions, and you would be very self-conscious of questions to pose, and also path that you may want to explore in dealing with particular individuals. Otherwise, the individual medical practitioner, who could even be African, but they were trained to not address the healthcare needs of African people, would produce the same outcome. But if this person, as an African person, are a very anti-racist medical professional who is aware, who has studied medical challenges within particular communities, they would approach it in a similar way. Because with Scott, the medical practitioner that he used, was this person an African person or a white person?
The doctors who were giving me the ineffective drugs, one of them was Coptic Egyptian. One of them was, as best as I can recall, Mediterranean. I think Italian or Greek or something. And then I had a third who was sort of more you know, what your standard white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Canadian. And then the doctor that I see now, I'm not sure, but I think he's Middle Eastern. But you know, so that my experience shows that there was a pretty a mix of different racial backgrounds, but they were all trained in the same way. You know, so like the military doctors, they're all getting their degree through the military system, which is inherently like, you know, by design is meant to be blind to any differences other than the difference in rank.
Right, and for example, in terms of even healthcare, if you have medical or mental health challenges, and you're, for example, of someone from the working class, a working class background, African working class Jamaican background, a lot of times our belief about mental illness is that it's something externally generated, that somebody could obey you or, you know, carry out magic on you. You think it's externally generated. So until you have intervention that incorporates Obia's healing traditions, and also then combine it with Western psychotherapy, it is not going to work. So you would have to have an understanding of the healthcare of the healing traditions and the medical or folk beliefs of African working class Jamaican in order for it to work. Canadian healthcare system is very much a racist educational system. It doesn't include the healing traditions of South Asians, Chinese, Africans from the continent of Africa, and also Africans from the Caribbean. So a lot of African people from the Caribbean are going into their pocket to seek medical care, healing care from their say Obia practitioners, or people are going to acupuncturists to get their treatment. So the Canadian healthcare system is perpetuating white supremacy and anti-African racism because it doesn't integrate healing traditions that people are using. So Africans are generally poor relative to white. So they're going into their pocket to get money to provide for their full healthcare needs. So when we talk about changing structures, processes, institutions, that's what we're talking about. Because I could have that understanding that we need to incorporate Obia in it, but the person will still have to go into their pocket to meet their full healthcare needs. The healthcare system in Canada would include all healing traditions, and we would pay for that. We as Canadians would pay for that as taxpayers, as citizens.
I'm going to jump in because there's one more foundational question that I want to tackle before we move on to a couple of other topics. Barbara asked, or she says, white supremacy versus white privilege. How would you respond? I'm not quite sure how to respond to that myself.
For me, the privilege discourse, most people, when they talk about privilege, they are talking about, they conflate or mix up earned privilege and unearned privilege. I think when we're talking, even without knowing it, we're talking about unearned privilege, because if someone goes off to university and acquire the relevant degrees, that is an earned privilege. However, because of class advantages, they may have unearned access to the system, but doing the actual work that results in you acquiring a degree, that's an earned privilege that you're experiencing. So I generally don't use the privilege discourse because of the confusion of unearned privilege, which is the one that we're talking about, whether it's racially unearned, class unearned, gender unearned privileges that you're having. But white supremacy is the overall system. And for me, white supremacy and racism is synonymous, because functionally, the only type of racism that we have to face in terms of structurally is white supremacy. Because other folks can also be racist, but you may have racist thoughts, racist feelings, but it's not represented institutionally in the educational system, the healthcare system, the criminal injustice system, nothing like that. It's just feelings that you have and prejudices. You may express it at an individual level in causing undue harm to someone because you've bought into certain racist ideas, but structural racism is white supremacy in Canadian society. But privilege, exists. But we're talking about unearned privilege. So we need to make it clear what it is we're talking about. So when someone's talking about white privilege, again, we're talking about unearned privilege.
I'm just looking for, I'm just looking for I'm looking for a specific question that is related to, oh geez, it may have been deleted, but it was about, oh yeah, Marty Shoemaker says, one of the problems in systemic racism is the predictors for job success, such as educational level and criminal record, will underrepresent minority groups that have lower economic opportunity, so less education, more likelihood of criminality. Is the expectation, this is where we're getting to the question, is the expectation that companies will overlook these predictors and hire people that evidence will not support as a top prospect? In other words, and then he goes on to say, is this one of the problems of capitalism and wanting to get the best bang for the buck as opposed to an equality issue? So I think what Marty's getting at is, should businesses go out of their way to hire unqualified African people or any other racialized person?
Well, when we're thinking in terms of people with conviction records, white males or whites in the United States have a higher chance of being hired in that company than even Africans who with the educational qualification. So it's not just about having criminal record, because they will take a chance on white convicts, even though in general white convicts will have a hard time. But when we're comparing it racially, we will see that companies are more willing to give a second chance to a white person with a conviction, with a criminal record, as opposed to an African one. So the question of lacking qualification is not a part of it. Because if a white high school graduate has a higher employment prospect than college-educated African male, so it's not about education. And when I talk about the significance of class, in such a case, we have the white supremacist system and the class system using race as a way to divide people. So an African person will look and say, see, racism is the primary problem in society, because here's an unqualified white worker being given a job over a college-educated African person. But it is still a class-based society that is using race or gender or sexual orientation to cause division within the ranks of the oppressed, the marginalized. So it's not a question of lack of qualification, because if the job calls for this qualification, it doesn't, unless the employer is going to ignore the basic qualifications and employ someone unqualified. And it's the same thing around the question of affirmative action or employment equity, which is a language in Canada. When people are saying, oh, this white male was more qualified, but then someone who was racialized was less qualified, what you're talking about is that you may need a minimum of a first degree to get a job. But this white man has 10 years of experience and the racialized person may have 5 years. But after 1 year in that position, you should be thoroughly competent in the job. So substantively, the white man is not more qualified, he's only doing the job for a longer period, 5 more years. But after 1 year in this position, the average person or the person who just barely be registering a pulse, they should be able to competently do this job. He's not more qualified. We're caught up in a quantitative issue as opposed to a qualitative. What can these two persons do? And because there's underrepresentation, you're saying that We have to radically change the pattern of employment. So we will put the person with 5 years of experience in the job, and the person with 10 years will not get it. That's not being given a job to unqualified people. That type of reasoning is just used to distract from the question of substantially changing racial patterns in hiring and retention.
I'm just keeping half an eye on the clock here, and I see that Tanya has asked the question that I was going to bring up. So I'll address both. There's been a lot of talk about defunding the police recently. What does that mean? Is it a good idea? And what might an alternative approach be to addressing social problems like crime, poverty, addiction?
The thing is, we should also, once we understand the role of police in a state-based society, we understand that the police exists to serve and protect the interests of the ruling class, the capitalist ruling class, the privileged racial groups, the privileged gender groups in society. It exists to police the inequalities in society. Without the police, you and I could go and dispossess members of the ruling class. We will get our armament and we will go and take them on. But the police and the soldiers are there as institutional forces to protect the oppressive social order. So what we're not going to see is the unfunding of the police, because that's a basic part of our state society. One of the functions of the state, a capitalist state, is to have a monopoly on violence, and that's expressed through the police. Other functions of a capitalist state is to facilitate profit or capital accumulation, and also to provide legitimacy in the eyes of the people for the existing system of oppression in society. So when they provide healthcare, that's a legitimation function, because we say it's so great to be Canadian and we're not like those ugly Americans. We have universal healthcare and we feel proud of the society. You know, they engage in these programs, not because of the kindness of their heart. One is because of the struggle from below that we force them to make concession, but they do these things for us to feel good about the existing social arrangements or the oppressive nature of society. So the defunding, we must push for that, but it's not going to happen. What we need to do is to create in working class communities our own structures to undermine the police, to undermine the courts by creating our own forces that we will police the norms in our communities. So if there are negative forces, we will have the capacity to take them on. And that's for that reason why I support self-defense networks across communities to take on all hostile forces, whether it's institutional forces or to take on the lumpen forces that I believe work with the system. And when I talk about lumpen, I'm talking about the criminalized lumpen elements who a lot of times contribute to destabilization of our community. And if you're destabilizing working class communities through the activities that you're involved with, you're an enemy of the people. So we must have that, but we have to go beyond that, because a lot of us we're not really committed to overthrowing the oppressive social order, which is capitalist racist.
And I would say that, like, I'm guessing that most of the audience here are probably not part of any kind of radical political. You're probably addressing people who are somewhere between a conservative and an NDP, or Green Party or liberal. You know, like so how do you so you know, in terms of defunding the police, from your perspective, regardless of any relationship to overthrowing the state that or you know, that you would have as say like a revolutionary, you know, for this audience that is primarily, you know, in the political mainstream, would you support a broad popular defund the police movement? And what would replace police? Like, you talked about these self-defense networks, but I don't think most people would want to.
But what I want to show is that many people who are saying defund the police do not have an ideological understanding of the system in which they're a part of. The police is a basic feature of state-based societies. They exist to police inequalities, and it's for that reason that they're more violent in working class communities, in indigenous communities, in queer communities in the past, where they would go and police the inequalities in society. That is their function. The state is not going to throw them out because they are needed to maintain the social inequalities that we have in society. So when we're calling for defunding the police, it is not going to happen until we get rid of this oppressive society. So what we should be focusing on is creating alternatives. So for example, having self-defense network, but also having popular restorative justice structures in civil society, in the movements, that we will deal with norm breaking. So if someone steals or someone should injure someone, they would come before the structure and we would adjudicate. And I'm using restorative justice principles. So it's not about retribution. It's about bringing this individual back to balance with him or herself or the community. What we're doing is to undermining the current justice system that is based on social, economic, racial, gender inequalities. So while we're working, we're struggling and fighting against the oppressive order, we're creating the alternative structures that will be fully realized in the just societies, in the good societies of the future. So when I hear people going on to defund the police, this is something that they haven't really reflected on in a deep way. It's just something to throw out there. Defunding of the police in terms of unfunding of the police. We're not talking about reallocating 20% of the budget to this thing. We're talking about undermining policing in society. Defunding the police is a nice little campaign, but it's not deeply ideological. It's even moderate thing because
okay, then like if you're talking to, I'm going to move on because I have a couple of things that I want to get to before we open up the Q&A. But I want to pull on this thread because it's so contemporary, and I think what I don't want is for you for the two of us to talk past the audience that we're addressing, and generally speaking, I would say people who join Humanist Canada and CFIC are smart, above average education. So I'm not trying to mollycoddle, but I'm just worried that okay. So I think I understand your radical position on policing.
It's not even radical.
Well, it is.
No, you remember the G20 summit that we had here. It was the first time that the people that you're saying are most of the audience here was seeing police violence on the television screen or live and direct because they were witnessing it. So when racialized people were saying, our interaction with the police on a daily basis is a very violent and brutal, undesirable one. But people were saying if the police can be beating civilians who are not a threat to them in the daytime on national television, then what are they doing at 2 a.m. in the morning when they meet racialized people or they meet working class white people? Because that's also one of the things we don't talk about. The whites who experience the brutal experience of policing in Canada are white working class people.
That's a good segue. Hold that. Hold the thought. That's a perfect segue. I want to talk really quickly before we run out of time about Dr. Roland Fryer. He's a Harvard scholar who published some controversial research that found no racial disparity when it comes to the most extreme use of police force in the United States. Now, we don't always have well-published data for Canada, so I'm just going to extrapolate here using the American example. His research found that African and Latin Americans are more likely to experience police violence, but that when it comes to police killings or the most extreme form of police violence, his findings show no significant difference. Now, some scholars have criticized his methodology and picked around the edges, but generally speaking, he's a well-regarded researcher, and his findings have been like he said himself that he was surprised by his own findings. What does that mean for so if I'm no more likely to be murdered by the police than the next guy, but they're more likely to rough me up, what does that mean to you?
No, but Scott, you pointed to the fact that there are methodological problems with his research and also conceptual theoretical problems, because he will look and he will say, okay, he use a term, statistical discrimination, and what he's saying is if there's a say a 50% or say a 20% chance that, and this person was looking at the study was saying, if you know that in a particular city, 50% of the taxi drivers are likely to be in possession of drugs, and then the police have a 50% chance are stop African people at a rate that's 50% higher than white cab drivers. They're saying then that is not statistical discrimination, because he's drawing an economics to deal with the field of criminology. So there are issues around the concept that he used. Also, in the case of even police brutality, we know that police lie on these forms. So when they interact with African people, they always see a higher threat level. And so that reason why a white person can fire 50 bullets at a police officer or a number of police and still survive. We just need to have a cell phone and they shoot us and say that, oh, I thought it was a gun that a person had. Yet a white person can, anytime we, as African people, we hear a confrontation with the police and the police bring in a shooter alive, we know it's a white person. You witness a white person alive. And that is something that we know. So his problem, it had methodological problems, and also the data on which he drew to make his conclusions were problematic. That police report of experience, because part of his thing is that when you look at the context and other factors, you realize the police are not more likely, because if the police experience a higher threat level from African people, then it's not a disproportionate number of killings. So that's why he put that faulty study out. The New York Times had it on its website, and it was one of the most read articles because it reinforced the biases that people have about the threatening African person. And here in Canada, we have the same thing. When the police kill Africans, in a lot of cases, you're saying this is a questionable shooting, but their perception level is very, very high. And it's not just, I saw a report and a study talking about, I think it was the city of Chicago, and it was showing that African-American police have a higher rate of shooting Africans in a mistaken case where they think the cell phone is a gun, because they also fear an African, because they're part of the system. Remember, Jess Jackson was the one talking about walking down the street and it's late at night and he just hope it's not a young African person behind him. We in working class African communities are the ones who experience a higher level of victimization when it comes to crime. So we also have a perception of who some of the threatening forces would be. But the police should not be engaging in racial profiling. Criminal profiling is a different thing. We have to look at objective criteria to determine whether you should stop this person or whether the person's a threat. But just simply being African, and you say you experience a higher threat level, and then prior to use that to say that the context suggested that the police experience a higher level of threat, and police always misrepresent their experience with African people. We can just look at the videos that circulate on social media and see how the police use higher level of force, unwarranted force against African people. So when they put that in the report about the threat level, we are not seeing the video, we're just seeing the police statement. So when we do that, then we would say in the context that the police was in, they were justified in shooting because this group tend to have a higher level of threat to the police, and police reported this threat level. So you wouldn't see that as an overrepresentation of police shooting.
So would you be in favor of body cams?
Police violence. Prior, and because of his institutional connection to Harvard, we're rating him, he's an economist, dabbling in criminology where he has little competence. So when we hear things like that, we just say, oh, that's just a gladiator defending the system in order to justify killing African people.
Ajamu, so that, would you be in favor of body cams as an interim measure for police forces?
Well, the thing about body camera, the fact that the police don't like it, it may mean something that can be used, but there are also issues with that. But one of the things that's very clear, that even when we show police and camera doing certain things, many of them, a lot of times they get acquitted. You may have the certain extreme cases because they're always telling you the context and all of those things. And also when you go before white jurors, when they see that, they feel that, wow, it was justified because Rodney King was threatening. How is Rodney King threatening when you have all these police beating the hell out of him? But he was resisting, he was violent. So even when white juries, that white dominated juries, look at the evidence, they reach different conclusions because they also believe that Africans are a threat to their safety. And even if they have doubt, yes, you know what? Let's give the benefit of the doubt to the police. If I'm wrong, higher courts will determine that and throw out the case. So there are things, and that's what I'm saying, the processes, the structures in place lead to particular outcome. So it's not just individual feeling, even though individuals are the ones who are administering the structures, but it's part of a system in place. And if you become an outlier in the structure, you're going to be pushed out. So a white person is coming and challenging certain things. If they don't organize and have a strength in their organization, people see them as troublemakers, and before you know it, the supervisors start to over-supervise them. Where the I's are not dots, the T's are not crossed, then they're going to get in trouble and get pushed out.
I have two more quick questions. So we're going to go a little bit over time, but I think it's worth it. Recently, some Canadian corporations have pledged what's being called the 3.5 pledge, where 3.5% of their senior level executive positions will be reserved for African Canadians, and it's of course a reference to the rate of the overall population, African population in Canada. So what impact do you think it would have if a company like CIBC had 3.5% Black executives? Is that a great first step?
No, it's just the petty bourgeois elements or class privilege elements within the African community who are going to join these unchanged structures, and they're just going to screw the working class African people just the same as their white colleagues. Because the system is unchanged and they're going in to serve the interest. My interest is in the condition of the oppressed, the down-pressed, the marginalized. I am looking at how things will be for them, because if they were saying that they were going to push for a minimum wage that's $25 per hour, or they're going to provide educational benefits that would benefit working class people, then I could say, yes, this is going to work. But having more conservative or moderate African people in position of power, it should happen, because based on fairness, you may also get some progressive people who may enter that rank, but it shouldn't be overblown in terms of the effectiveness of that. All you're going to do is just racially diversify the oppressive and exploiting petty bourgeois elements who are serving their class masters or their race masters.
Well, every plantation had an African overseer, after all, or most of them did.
But at the same time, many of the rebellions that we had, the house slaves that Malcolm X, in his ahistorical understanding of the field slave and the house slave, were very critical to rebellion, because writing passes to help people to escape. Usually the house slaves would get the chance to read, because someone within the house, the white household, may like them and teach them to read, so they can write these passes that say, I, Master John Brown, allow this person to pass. So even the house slaves, when you poison the master, it's not the field slaves who did that. You didn't have no access to those, you didn't work. So the field slave had to do that. So in the context of some progressive people getting into these executive positions, they can go in there and become agents of the revolution or agents of social change inside there, but they have to be connected to social movements or organizations. So what I'm saying is that everything is really a balance, and we have to really analyze it without emotion in terms of how certain people can be inserted in structures to become agents. But most people will serve the cause of empire, will serve the cause of the dominant structures. Whether it's in the university, we do need more racialized people in it, but most of them will end up just doing business as usual. But it may create a space for for minority forces to go in there and use that as an arena for struggle.
Okay, so it's like it's an okay thing. We just have modest hopes for what it would actually achieve.
Yeah, our focus is elsewhere. We're looking at the most oppressed and marginalized, and how we can change structures in Canada so that African people can benefit and other oppressed groups can benefit in society.
Okay, last one. So you've called in from Jamaica, which is about 92% African, or at least mixed African, And
over 90%
yeah.
over 95%.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of the police officers are Africans.
Yes,
and at the police and armed forces in Jamaica kill people at a rate that would make even the most violent American city look like a peaceful utopia.
Absolutely.
What can we infer about this? Is policing, obviously, in Toronto we have Mark Saunders, who's a lot of talk about him being the first Black or African chief of police in this city. So if Jamaican cops are mostly African and they're killing people by the boatload, is this race? Like, how can we blame this on race?
No, and that's why we're saying that you have to look at race and class. Most of the people who are being killed in Canada and in the United States, African people, are from the working class. You don't see a lot of cases of petty bourgeois, middle-class Africans being killed by the police. They're predominantly from the working class. In the same way, when police kill white people in Canada, they're predominantly from the working class. And so that's the reason why we have to look at a class analysis and a race analysis when we talk about oppressive conditions in racist society. For example, in Jamaica, in 2019, Jamaica has a population of 3 million people. The police killed 86 civilians, the police and the soldiers. The soldiers kill about 3, because now increasingly we have soldiers patrolling the streets with police. In the United States in 2019, with a society that year 328 million people, the police killed 1,017 people. So, and when you look at in terms of the per capita rate per 100,000 people, Jamaican police killed 2.96 Jamaicans as opposed to 0.31 Americans by the American police. If we have that rate of killing in Jamaica, we would feel happy. We just said, okay, they're doing a good job. They're reforming. And because of we have a commission, a special investigations commission, they call it INDICOM, or Independent Commission of Investigation. They are the ones that have brought down police killing. In 2010, the police killed 210 civilians. But by the next year, it went to 100 and odd because of this investigation body. And actually, it was modeled on the Special Investigative Unit from Ontario. However, the Jamaican one is different, that body can lay charge against the police. It doesn't need the endorsement of the Attorney General. And the police are afraid of it because police killing has gone down dramatically. So what we're saying is that in class-based societies, racist societies, the poor will disproportionately feel the impact of policing, class-based policing and race-based policing. So in Jamaica, it's mostly working class people who are killed by the police. In Canada, it's mostly working class African people within the African population who are killed or injured by the police. And it's the same thing in the United States. So class is there as a mediating force. And if Canada was 99% white, it would be mostly white working class who would be killed or brutalized by the police. So
gotcha.
We have race and class.
I see, Ajamu, I see Shauna is getting our attention. So I think we're out of time for the conversation, and we're going to throw it open to questions.
So thank you very much to Ajamu and Scott for some very thought-provoking information, discussion, etc. We've had a few of the questions that have been submitted. Some were submitted previously by email. I've got a selection of the questions that have come into the Q&A panel. Of course, we have received a lot of really good questions, and unfortunately we'll not be able to get to them all. I'm going to be trying to select a representative subset, and I'm going to ask both Ajamu and Scott if you want to respond to each of the questions, if you have something to say about it. So the first one, and I'm not sure if this has been addressed or not, but we're still getting questions. People want to hear concrete examples of what you would consider to be structural racism.
When we talk about structural racism, in policing, the differential outcomes that we see in terms of police killings, shootings, cases of police brutality, these are manifestations of race, the structural racism that exists within policing. Because when you compare whites who are armed, and they usually survive the confrontation police, there are times that they will even fire shots at the police and they still survive, as opposed to a person who was unarmed. They are seen, like racial African people are seen as a greater threat to the police. But that is based on the larger notion of Africans being a threat, an ever-present threat to, I guess, peace, order, and good government in Canada. And that is what we see going on. In terms of employment, or even in a case of even unionization, you haven't seen disaggregated stats for African people, but in terms of racialized people, we're underrepresented in Canadian unions as members as a result of we not getting access to the types of jobs that provide union coverage. For example, looking at a city like Toronto, that's about 50% racialized. And look at the bus drivers. These are unionized jobs. It should, when you look at it, you should say at least 50% of the bus drivers being racialized. When you look, go to a school board and you look and see who the janitors are, they used to, a lot of times they are overrepresented with Eastern European men. So these are immigrant white men or that are in these unionized jobs. They're in such a lucrative position, even though it's working class jobs. This is, a manifestation of structural racism in place, because they may hire through word of mouth. So the people who are already there will be the ones to recommend families and friends or people within their racially based network. So when we talk about structural racism, the process of recruitment has biases in it, because they're saying, okay, we want people, you don't advertise the jobs widely and in communities that are underrepresented. You encourage your existing members of the organization or workers to go and share it among their friends. So, even just in terms of even recruitment, you have to change these things in order to have a racially diverse or racially representative workforce in jobs that are seen as lucrative. And we can look at it, various things in terms of suspension rates in schools. Why is it that Indigenous children and African children are overrepresented in suspension and expulsion from school? Why is this underrepresentation? They are seen as a greater threat to the teacher. They're perceived as greater threat. So they're likely to be, you're likely to have punitive measures being imposed on them. And that is also a part of the racial biases that we may find specifically in the educational system. And it's for that reason why in African communities or Indigenous communities, we see schools as pipelines to the prison industrial complex, because that's where you're sending them. For example, there may be conflict, in school, confrontation between students, and you're bringing in police. The police come, they're going to see African children as a greater threat. They may be more willing to bring them to the police station or even to charge them, as opposed to white students that they may just settle it inside the school without calling the police. That they don't see the white students as a greater threat as African or Indigenous students. So, the structural racism, because of the processes in place and the structures that are there, and the people who are the personnel in it, will lead to prejudicial outcomes.
Thank you, Ajamu. Scott, did you have anything to add about that?
No, I mean, we talked about the healthcare system as well, and some of the unequal outcomes that happen. But I would say it basically touches on every institution, and the main reason for that would be the history of it. And since we're trying to be focused on anti-African racism, I would say that Canada's history of the institutions were not set up with African equality in mind, either in opportunity or outcome. In fact, the system was designed for most of its history to keep African people out, contrary to what Canadians like to tell themselves about being the terminus of the Underground Railroad. I think it's important to look at how those African refugees fleeing slavery were treated upon arrival. And for anyone who doesn't know the history, it was one of containment and isolation, where the first waves of African runaway slaves to settle in Canada were primarily in southwestern Ontario. They're primarily agricultural, and as the country was okay with them as long as they were not on the best bits of land, as long as they didn't talk to white women, as long as they kept to themselves and kept quiet. And it was really when a subsequent wave of African migration where people were primarily coming to the cities, where you started seeing things like the Canadian KKK and other manifestations of white supremacy working to contain the urban African population. So it's again, when I say we've got to become historians, like this is the stuff that you can learn about in an hour-long podcast or something. You know, it's not you don't have to go very deep. You don't need a doctorate or a degree even to start to grapple with this. The fact that, you know, it was when my grandfather, for example, migrated to Canada. It was at a time when immigration from the Caribbean was specifically not allowed. He got in because he was able to demonstrate that he had been accepted into a Canadian university. But beyond that, like he was there to study. By the time he finished his degree, the immigration laws changed, and he was allowed to stay. But you know, the whole setup has been designed to keep Africans out and to contain them when they get here. So that is naturally going to be reflected in the country's institutions.
Yeah, and that's a good example that Scott pointed to. Racialized people are just around 20% of Canada's population, unlike the US, where it's about close to 40%. If Canada hadn't put in place immigration barriers, racialized people would be about 30 or 40% of Canada's population. We had the continuous journey rule from India to Canada that in order for you to be accepted here, you must engage in a continuous journey. In those days, you didn't have ships that could leave from the Indian subcontinent to Canada, so the continuous journey prevented them from coming. In terms of African people even from the United States and of course the Caribbean, they were discriminated against because the immigration rules say that you're not going to bring people in who would not be suitable for the climate or the weather that we have here, even though Africans were enslaved in Canada. So we have a history of being here, enslaved and also as free people in Canada. But those were structural racist barriers in terms of facilitating racialized immigration, while Canadian authorities were glad to bring in people from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. Of course, that desirable immigrants would have been those from Northern Europe or Western Europe, but they would take even Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans because at least they're not racialized, to bring them here. And when we look at Canada and now we're praising the multicultural character of the society, multiracial character of the society, it's only because Canada needed immigrants in the 1960s that in 1968, they adopted the point system immigration procedure that were more objective. Europe was engaged in a reconstruction and it needed its laborers. They weren't migrating in numbers to Canada, but also Canada was calling out racist South Africa for its behavior. But these emerging nations out of Africa and the Caribbean were saying, well, you have a racist immigration system in place. What are you talking about? So Trudeau didn't change the immigration system because he loved racialized people, which a lot of racialized voters have this illusion about Trudeau. He did it because it was in Canada's economic interest to bring in racialized people to do the dirty work, notwithstanding the level of education that they entered with.
Thank you. So another question that's come up a couple different ways. So I know at one point there was some discussion about traditional medicine and other approaches to medical care, and I know that one of the things that many people in Center for Inquiry and Humanist Canada are quite concerned about is pseudoscientific medicine. And so the question is, how how do you draw the line? How do you carefully tread this problem between the promotion of traditional practices that might be potentially unhelpful but are traditional to racialized communities?
Oh, when you're talking about pseudoscientific, I thought you were talking about Western medicine, because Scott gave you the example of going there and they're using pseudoscience to treat him. They didn't, because it's based on prejudicial outcome. Remember, we're living in a society, in terms of medicine, there's a term I think called droptomania that they had for enslaved Africans in the United States, that if you have a propensity to run away, that's thought as a psychological problem. And these were scientists using scientific method. So when we're talking about mythology or pseudoscience, we can also apply it to the revered and much loved Western medicine. Because many of the people that they're treating with pills, some people have become even more drugged up, and they're based on sound scientific principles. So if it's a question of pseudoscience, I guess all of we have a bit of pseudoscience in our healing traditions.
Yeah, I would add that things like the opiate epidemic stems almost entirely from mainstream medicine, the overprescription of opioids. So as much as I support and I'm in favor of skepticism and some of the core values of certainly a group like CFI, but it's just let's apply the standard equally. There's woo-woo in every culture, and I would say, and there's destructive practices in every culture. I think neither Ajamu nor I have any kind of fetishistic belief in something being good just because it's African. There were African kings, there were Africans involved in the slave trade. There were Africans who oppressed other Africans, and that continues to this day. So it's not like we're placing everyththing African on a pedestal. Rather, my position would be that we should be more more skeptical about some of the claims that are a little bit more dubious. The claims and practices. I certainly don't. There's no evidence that prescribing opiates on a mass level is good for a population. Just for one example.
The thing about the medical healing traditions, belief is a fundamentally important part of it. If I don't believe psychotherapy can heal me of my mental health challenges, it cannot heal me. If I don't believe these pills that I'm being given, so belief is a fundamental part, and we find in traditional healing system there are belief structures involved in it. So if I believe that I have a mental illness because someone obey me or work juju on me or magic on me, it means that I may have to go through certain ritual procedures in the traditional healing in order for psychotherapy to work, to deal with whatever challenges I'm experiencing. So what are we going to say that? We know that the belief of people is that someone put an X on me, someone obey me, someone did this to me. But we're not going to use the rituals and combine it with psychotherapy. It's like we're defeating ourselves. So we're going to find we may find a higher level of mental illness within a certain population because of their belief structure about the cause or the causes behind illnesses. We're going to integrate them, but what I'm saying, in order to have equity in Canada, we must pay for Chinese healing traditions because the people are already consulting those sources, because the Canadian healthcare system cannot meet their full need for medical attention. So they're going outside and paying out of their pocket. So health inequity exists in our healing system here because we're using the Western one, and that's the one that we pay for. But the other people are going outside and using both the Western, Eastern, African, Caribbean healing practices. The only thing is that whites may end up paying, and some whites are also paying it out of their pocket for these services.
Oh yeah, they love acupuncture and stuff like that. It's very popular, but it's. I think the question is one where it's like, what the sort of put to the pushback here. I would say, Shauna, in terms of my answer would be, do skeptics want to be right or do they want to be effective? Because those are two different things. So like where Ajamu was talking about Obeah, I mean that's not a belief system that I have. I'm a materialist. I'm an atheist. But I'm not the target audience for that kind of, you know, if I do believe in that, and you know, we don't have to go to anything exotic. If you know, if I saw you know, like a traditional Baptist, you know, white Canadian Baptist who believes in Christianity, God and Jesus and miracles and stuff, like I don't have to agree that those stories are true or that they're right for me to agree that incorporating those beliefs into say like mental health therapy into some form of therapeutic approach, one that doesn't acknowledge the subjective beliefs of a patient is probably going to be less successful in the long run.
Thank you. We're just about at the end, so I was hoping we could have just one final question, then we'll wrap up. I think we could probably have spent several more hours on this, and we've just sort of cracked the surface. So one question a couple people have asked about thoughts about monuments and street names which commemorate people who supported slavery and other forms of oppression. Now I know it's a huge topic, and I'm asking you because our time is so late, if you could each limit yourselves to just about 1.5 minutes each.
Can I just say that I know that Ajamu and we might have some friction between us here. I know where he's going, and it's not going to put me in the best light. So you go first, brother.
Oh, I was going to give you the privilege of going first.
No, because I want to be ready to defend myself.
The thing is that names are very important symbols. When men impose their names on women during marriage, it's to suggest ownership. It's like to say this entity is mine, so I'm naming it, I'm giving its name. So naming is about self-determination. And if we have oppressive forces having monuments built to them, it's communicate at a symbolic level or supporting the structural oppression that exists. So we must take down all of these symbols, names of streets, names on buildings, any name that support oppression. We must go after it. Symbols are important because a lot of times oppressed people develop the courage after challenging symbols, then they start to go after the substantive basis of power. For me, we're going at both of them at the same time, but we're dealing with things as they objectively exist. And if you have success in bringing down important symbols, then it may give you that strength and that commitment, conviction to go after those major symbols. But the thing I also say that if we're calling for us to remove colonial names from buildings, then those of us, whether it's indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, who have colonial personal names, we must also legally get rid of all of these names, because that is a part of the process. When we talk about Jesse Jackson, that's a slave name. What the hell in 2020 he's doing with such a name? And he would be calling for bringing down symbols and changing names of streets. That's contradiction. We must rid ourselves. And the same thing with a lot of indigenous people. They have legal names that are colonial names. They may, in a community, may have an indigenous name, but when they get a passport or deal with official transaction, it's the colonial names that they're using. We must get rid of all of those things.
Yeah, and then my response is that I think it's a real my response is a real CFI kind of response, in that I think, I believe in iconoclasm. I don't believe that these totems have any particular power or meaning, and yet in and of themselves, okay, the object, the brass, the sculpture itself has no magical or mystical totemic power. So what I struggle to understand is why does it mean so much to and I'll say it's touching a nerve for European people, when folks get together and say we're going to tear down this image, or we're going to in fact right now I don't know what the current status is, but as of last night there were 3 young members of Black Lives Matter Toronto who spent the night in custody for the egregious crime of spray painting an old dead guy on a horse. Now, if that statue means more to the society than the peaceful protest, I mean, the nuisance, at worst case scenario, that kind of graffiti tagging is a nuisance. But if that nuisance is so so anxiety generating for white people or European people in this country, then I think that's kind of pathological. I think that probably calls for some kind of therapy or some kind. So people have to talk it out and find a way to interrogate why these images and symbols mean so much. Because to me, it's the equivalent of worshiping a golden calf or any other kind of religious icon. It strikes me as profoundly bizarre that would be. So that if my neighbor told me that my painting was so upsetting, like, and I had it pointing out in the street in public, I put it in my front yard, and it's a painting of something obscene, let's say, that violates the norms of my community. And the neighbor said, "Man, that is such an offensive, hurtful piece of like it's okay for you to have it, but can you not project it into my face every day as I walk my kids to school?" Like if I insist on my rights to put whatever I want on my property, regardless of community norms, that makes me the asshole. Like it's me being unwilling, being refractory, and not being willing to be a good neighbor. So the fact that people are getting upset about some stupid old statue made of bronze being defaced, I mean, that's your totem. I don't understand it. It seems completely and sorry, I shouldn't say yours in the specific audience. I'm talking about people who are upset by statue vandalizing or statue iconoclasm. I'm hoping that if there's one thing that the CFI audience out here today will be enthusiastically in support of, it's that we should be iconoclasts.
Thanks, Scott. I think that's a very good way of closing. And I will support that. We should be iconoclasts, and so I'm going to close now. On behalf of the sponsors, Dundurn Press, Humanist Canada, and Centre for Inquiry Canada, I want to say a hearty thank you to our speakers, Ajamu Nangwaya and Scott Fraser. And also thanks to everybody who attended, and especially to those who asked the thoughtful and thought-provoking questions. And thanks to everybody who also donated so that we can support Banned Black Artists Network Dialogue. And on your screen, there's a list of the sponsoring organizations. And thanks everybody for attending. I hope this is the start of a discussion that we can continue.
Thank you very much, Shauna, and everyone at Humanist Canada and CFI. Keep up the good, important work that you are all doing, and thanks for sharing some time with us.
And thanks to sponsoring organization, Scott, and also people participate. I was just looking at some of the questions, and you really asked some really good questions. So it suggests that there's also a need for greater dialogue in the community about how to deal with the question of anti-African racism in general, and also class oppression, because class is a problem that trips up a lot of us, because we don't have an understanding of what class is, or class relations is, and that will affect the solutions that we're putting together, things that we're proposing to these problems. So education is critical, but we also need to be in organizations with programs and projects, institutions that we're building to challenge oppressive conditions. Otherwise, we're going to have a situation where we rise up, and after 2 weeks, we sit down until the next incident, and we rise up, and then we sit down. We have to organize 24/7 to destroy the oppressive social order, because they're operating their system on a 24/7 basis.
Thank you.